What up, everybody? I'm Jędrek, and this is the first episode of In Response, in which I will respond to your question that you ask me on my Discord, in my chat, or via Twitter DMs. However, from time to time, I will just gather your questions that you want me to ask or to answer, and well, I will just answer them, and hence the clever title of this series. Uh, so let's get right into it. The first question is from Reptune Repeat, and Reptune Repeat asks, "Have you considered holding up?" And by this they meant, "Have you considered holding up till the later stage of the game, similarly to as you do with Brainstorm and Legacy, to get more value out of it?" And I think it's a fairly interesting question. I don't think I've ever considered it like actively. Um, I just feel like Opt is a card you wanna cast early on because it doesn't have the same flat prevention power as Brainstorm has. Like the fact that setting up like good Brainstorm is so much better than bad Brainstorm in general, and bad Opt isn't that much worse than good Opt. So I think it's more important to dig for the cards you want early on in the matchup, and by turn 2 you should know what you are playing against, more or less. So the biggest argument could be made for whether you want or you maybe don't want to play Opt turn 1 on the play when you don't know what you are up against. And in those cases, I will usually still lean towards playing it, since Snapcaster Opt targeting or Snapcaster Mage targeting Opt on turn 3 is a pretty decent play, and if you cast Opt on 1, then you can Mana Leak or Fatal Push plus Tap Land on turn 2, and then you can Snap Opt on turn 3, which is a fairly decent sequence. However, I think holding Opt later into the game is pretty okay, because it can be a blue card for Force of Negation, and from time to time I have been doing that, but maybe a bit too rarely, and I think this is something that might be worth considering more. So thanks for this question, Reptune Repeat. So the next question is from Nathaniel, and Nathaniel asks, "How to avoid timing out of control?" And he asks whether how to do this on in paper and on MTGO. So let's start with MTGO, since this is the place where most of us plays most of our matches right now in pandemic, and I think that on MTGO it's pretty straightforward. There are four main parts to it, which are watching the clock, setting good stops, setting good or getting accustomed to key bindings, and general familiarity with models. So watching the clock is very simple. You just have to watch your clock from the beginning of the match, ideally in every match, but for starters, in matchups where you think you might time out. So control mirrors, something like Tron, something like maybe Amulet. When the game goes long, there is a higher chance to time out, obviously. So paying attention to your clock till since minute 1 is very important. Second one is stop, and I would say that having a well set stops is also very important. I usually have stops in my first main phase, in my beginning of combat, then all the way through my combat, obviously, and then my end step, and on opponent's turn it's their combat, their beginning of combat, and their end step. So I think most of those stops are kinda necessary. I don't think that beginning of combat step on your turn is that important. It's something I just have as a force of habit, because I've been playing with it for a long time. And if you are not accustomed to any particular set of stops, you can just you can just skip them, and this one is not needed, but that's what I do. Also, end of my own turn stop might be kinda weird, but since most of control decks that I'm playing these days have Teferi Hero of Dominaria, you want to have this stop for after you enter balance with Teferi. But the most important part about stops is that you just need to set them you just need to set them in a consistent fashion and then get used to it. I would recommend having the little lock symbol unlocked on Modo, so you can just add the stops as you go. And I will often add like my upkeep stop with cast advantages, or their upkeep stop if I want to cast something, their draw step stop if I want to Esper Charm or click, and so forth. So the next thing, key bindings. I'm a big fan of using 1, which is OK. It used to be F2, and 6, which is pass priority for the turn. It used to be F6. Also 5, which is cancel auto yields pass, so mostly cancel you pressing 6, comes up fairly often too. Some people like you to use 2, which is pass until opponent puts something on the stack or till the end of turn. I haven't really used that one in my life, but it sounds pretty okay. And if you're not accustomed to anything else, then you should try it out. And the last thing is general familiarity with the program. And after playing a bit, you'll get accustomed to bindings, client lag, your own network lag, and so on. So even though it might look daunting at first, after a bunch of matches, it should just become your second nature when you're playing Modo. And if you just mind the clock at all times, then it should be okay. In paper, it's a bit more complicated. I would say that watching your like you should start from yourself. Like if you improve your time management, then it will help you it will vastly improve your overall ability to not time out. And then after you already improved your time management, you can think about improving it via like external factors. So the first one is watching your pace from the beginning, just like on Modo with watching the clock. This includes something like your mechanics. So if you are the type that draws a card and just slowly drags it through your play mat and maybe like tap it on the board for good luck or something, just don't do this. It should be like just one motion, you're drawing and you are not losing time on this. And even if you need to drag it through your playmat, I'm sometimes guilty of it as well. Just do it quickly. It shouldn't take you more than like a second to draw a card. Something like untapping lands in one motion or whatever is also quite welcome. The second thing is politely harrying your opponent if they are slow, and you shouldn't be afraid to call judge on a GP or any other large event you are playing. If you suspect your opponent is playing slowly on purpose, or even if it's unintentional, it's your shared clock after all, and you have the right to call judge if your opponent is playing slowly. And the last one is consider scooping early in an unfavorable matchup if it doesn't go well game 1. So, for example, I tend to scoop quite early against Dredge with most control decks if I don't have any main deck graveyard hate, since post-board games against Dredge tend to be quite long, and it's important to save the time for the games that actually does matter. And like, for example, if we are playing blue-white with no graveyard hate and your opponent resolves a decent cathartic reunion on turn 2, just scoop and save some time. Okay, so the next question is also from Nathaniel, and Nathaniel asks how to win Control Mirror game 1. So it's been already asked in my Discord, and somebody jokingly answered that you should draw less dead cards than your opponent. Which is not really entirely true, I think. I think it depends on the exact matchup, of course, but usually it's about not using your good cards to answer their bad cards. Most of the time, both players have a bunch of dead cards, so card advantage isn't as important aside from hitting your land drops. Because game 1s tend to be quite long, and if you don't spew your important cards, for example, countering their divination or using your own Archmage's Charm to draw end of turn, even though you already have 1 or 2 lands in your hand, you should come on top of the opponent who is using their cards incorrectly. In the same vein, I usually wouldn't counter, for example, an EOT Snapcaster Mage flashing back cantrip from my opponent, even if I have Spellsnare, which is like a very efficient answer, since Spellsnare can be valuable later on to counter a Snapcaster on an actual counterspell, or counter their Mana Leak or whatever, and you have a bunch of pushes that can answer Snapcaster anyways, and if you don't answer Snapcaster with Fatal Push will just be dead. So yeah, just don't spew your good cards and you should be fine. Relatively fine. You can still lose, obviously. But I would say that this is the single biggest piece of advice I have. How to build sideboard to beat control. Once again, Nathaniel. People tend to skew their decks too much for control mirrors, in my opinion, since winning them gives them some type of ego boost because they believe that those decks matchups are more cerebral than more linear proactive decks. It's obviously not true, and you should only skew your sideboard towards control if it's the dominating archetype in the format. For example, when Uro was legal, it was okay to skew or even correct to skew your sideboard towards mirrors because it was very important to beat those. As far as some actual card recommendations on how to build it, I really like threads that dodge their interaction, cards that grant me some information, and Stubble Flash. So all of those three basically describes Vendilion Clique, which is, I think, the perfect card for the job. And I would play 2 copies before anything else if my goal was solely to beat other control decks. Other good cards in modern control mirrors that I would consider are stuff like Thoughtseize, Lovin's Veto, Teferi Time Raveler, Monastery Mentor, just to name a few. Another sideboard question, how to build sideboard for the expected metagame. So if you have a lot of time, you can just take your main deck, see how many bad cards you have in each matchup, and configure your sideboard to have exact right amount of cards for everything. Thanks to so many versatile sideboard options that you have access to, it's entirely possible to achieve this with 15-card sideboard, even in format as the diverse and modern. It's also paramount to have a sound plan against the best deck or decks already in Game 1 and have the sideboard that complements your Game 1 strategy. Another question from Nathaniel, this one comes up fairly often. How to beat Tron? So Tron used to be this nightmare matchup that you can never beat in the long game with control because they have this ridiculous inevitability. Well, it was true. Around 6 years ago, because that's the time when Eye of Ugin was banned, and ever since control has been getting few new tools like Planeswalkers in Jace and Teferi, Force of Negation, Field of Ruin, and nowadays you can actually beat Tron in the long game, I think. I would treat it similarly to a control mirror somehow, or somewhat. Don't spew your important cards on their unimportant ones. For example, I would never use a hard counterspell on their early Expedition map or Sylvan's Scrying, and in general, even later in the game, since they are so good at finding Tron, that fighting their mana is futile most of the time. And you just want to fight their threats. Because you have more answers in your deck than they have threats, usually, and you can just run them out of threats. One of the exceptions is when you land a Planeswalker, they already have Tron mana, and they are threatening your Planeswalker with a potential Blast Zone via Expedition map or via Sylvan's Scrying. Then it's obviously okay to consider countering it. Or like sometimes you can counter a tutor for Sanct of Ugin, but I think it's far less common than countering a tutor for Blast Zone. Another question from Nathaniel, a lot of good questions from him today. Why Counterspell won't break Modern? Because it's been rumored that Counterspell will be reprinted in Modern Horizons 2, and it's not certain, it's just a leak, so that one might not even come to fruition. But if that's the case, and if Counterspell will be reprinted, I would say that Counterspell and Mana Leak are very similar cards in essence, because Mana Leak is virtually an easier to cast Counterspell against a lot of decks most of the time, and it's significantly weaker mostly against other control decks and big mana. Given how control versus big mana looks, I don't think that Counterspell would change the matchup too much. Obviously it will add some percentage points, but it won't be like game breaking or anything, and control decks will become mostly better in the mirror, which doesn't really affect the format as a whole. You don't really care how good control deck is against other control decks metagame wise, because it won't affect other matchups and metagame shares for that matter. Obviously Counterspell would have been or would be, if they reprinted an upgrade to Mana Leak for the most part, but it's not a very significant upgrade, and I think that people are kinda over over dramatic with this one. So another one is once again from Nathaniel. He asks, what's your top 10 MH2, so Modern Horizons 2 reprints wishlist? Okay, so let's just go really fast through it. Number 10, okay, so disclaimer, I think all of those cards that I'm gonna list are perfectly fine for Modern. I don't think that they would be too strong, and most of them would probably make impact on the format. And yeah, it's just my wish list, so it's not really something I want to defend too much, because it's just cards that I would like to see. And yeah, the only thing I want to say is that I don't think any of those cards will be too good in Modern, or would be too good in Modern. So number 10 is Recoil, number 9 is Predict, number 8 is Unexpectedly Absent, number 7 is Innocent Blood, number 6 is Findorn Elves, number 5 is Wirewood Symbiote, number 4 is Back to Basics, number 3 is Riptide Laboratory, number 2 is Careful Study, or a color shifted red Careful Study, so basically Faithless Looting without flashback, and number 1 is, well, obviously Counterspell. So yeah, I don't think any of those cards would break Modern. I would like to see Phoenix be good again, because I think Phoenix is a very cool deck to have in my format. Maybe with Freeing Discovery already in the mix, Careful Study would boost Dredge too much, but then you can consider just banning something from Dredge. Only Sodek would be saddened by this development, I think. So yeah, this was my list of top 10 cards that I would like to see in Modern Horizons 2. And this was the first episode of In Response. So if you like this type of content, just be sure to let me know on Discord, because it's been fun doing this, and I would like to make it once again if you will have enough questions for me. So that's it for today, and I'm gonna see you later. Bye bye.